Good afternoon. My name is Cody Dalton, and this is Discussion Board 1. Today I'll be discussing Chapter 5 of Mark Noll's book, America's God. And in Chapter 5, he discusses how Christian Republicanism evolved from 1740 to 1790. Before the 1740s, there were connections between radical political discourse and Christian traditions, but the connections were a minority in the life of colonists. By 1721, their perception had changed. The Protestant Republican is best witnessed in the New England Courant, and this was a paper by James Franklin. It was the first outlet that published the writings of James's younger brother, Benjamin Franklin, and it was a forum for both radical politics and religion. This paper had people run it from door to door, and it was known for their combination of politics and religion, and it was a precursor to Christian Republicanism language. And Noll evaluates the change in Christian vocabulary in both ministers and revivalists. From the Great Awakening up until the Republic of the United States, the revivalists came out of the Great Awakening such as George Whitfield, Jonathan Edwards. They used a variety of language and politics, but they never kind of stayed on the same track as the newer people have. But they always did keep their focus on the purpose of winning souls for Jesus Christ. And Whitfield himself was really unique in this. He evaluated very early Christian republicanism. He broke the traditional rules of preaching because he allowed way more participation and freedom of worship than other people had. And he did this in 4 main different ways, which are highlighted in this chapter. He called for a direct and immediate response. He encouraged Christians to perform services. He let the participation be more relaxed than other people had. And the messages he had were preached that the relationship with the Lord and Savior was the most important thing that a Christian could have. And this language that he used in his preaching pushed spirituality, and later ministers would start copying this and kind of combine spirituality with civil liberty. One example of this he uses is Nathan Whitaker, a minister in Salem, Massachusetts, and he described Whitfield as a friend to religious liberty, but no less a friend to the civil liberties of man. He says he was a patriot and an enemy to tyranny. So if you look at the language, it had changed. It went from the early times in the Great Awakening to the ministers closer to the American Revolution. It changed from just being about bringing souls to Christ to bringing souls to Christ and fighting tyranny. And Noll breaks down different reasons for this and how the Christian Republicanism changed to this. And one of the major first reasons is the war with France. So as the war with France went on, many colonist newspapers painted France as a threat to the Protestant religion. And the ministers at the time took this and ran with it and used the language in their sermons, and these languages would be kind of anti-Catholic or anti-Whig, and just be anti the politics that were against the Protestant religious life. And one example of a minister that did this was Charles Chauncey, and he referred to salvation in which God secured the defeat in the French. So he was preaching that God would be on their side and he would help them defeat the French. And he also would use the Pope to kind of represent the evilness and the opposing ideology. So his language had shifted from the early days into this now an anti-Catholic and anti-Whig political ideology rhetoric. And the second example is as Republicanism helped push for religious reform, the newer generation of ministers started pushing for religious reform that dealt with liberty. So they would kind of combine America's freedom with their religious practices and their religious teachings. They would use this kind of language in their sermons. They would talk about spirituality and advocate strongly for individuals such as James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, who might not have been strictly Christian, but they were fighting in the freedom of America, and by using them, they were kind of combining these two fights into one fight. And they would also eventually use this language to attack the institution of slavery, and that would help play into getting slavery outlawed and eventual freedom of slaves. And the third point that Noll uses is how republicanism became more within the Christian language. It was more in the way of Republican it was more in the way that the Republicans had just changed themselves. As they evolved over time, so did the language. The leading patriots may not have been the most religious people, but they still had to use Christian language in their documents and their speeches, and this was their way to retain support for their rebellion, because the religious leaders being on their side kind of ensured that the majority of people would be on their side. And a common example of this was Thomas Paine's Common Sense, or the Constitution, or the Declaration of Independence. All these documents have biblical narratives or biblical wording or use God, and while the writers of these documents might not have been Christians by our definition today, they were still using this language. And his last point was the impact of the revolution itself and the experiences that the colonists faced and how that changed their language. And the revolution kind of forced colonists and the patriots alike to identify a new enemy. And the enemy was no longer France, like previously we talked about. It became the oppressive British. So the personal experiences of the British taxes and the British skirmishes kind of changed the way people saw them. It gave them a new enemy, and this new enemy would be used by the ministers and the government officials in America alike. And they would use these, or the fight against the British to kind of shape their speeches and their political ideology. And that would change the language that they used on their daily basis. So, the diversity of religions and politics in early America is kind of why the rhetoric used and the language used by these early revivalists and ministers changed. And later you can see this again when the delegates visit from France and they come to America, they offer to help America against the British, and suddenly we're just completely forgotten how we were calling for France's head and blaming France and the papacy just years earlier. So just in the matter of 20, 30 years, France had went from an enemy to a close ally. And this kind of was a unique situation, but due to the fact that they were both Christian, both wanted to be a democratic nation, it kind of played together and helped them become allies. So the main focus of this chapter just analyzes the evolution of Christian republicanism, how it changed over time, why it changed over time, and he gives us examples of this, and that is all.